Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session. I say good afternoon, although for Scott, it's good morning, and thank you for joining us. It's not too early on your side, but thank you anyway.
Good.
Yeah, and so this is our penultimate session of the stream. Thank you for coming to ZP&C. Hope you've enjoyed the last couple of days, and hopefully we'll see you all in November, as well as the final session later today. Scott is happy to take questions during, so if at any point you have questions, please post them in the chat. We'll try to answer them as we go, but we'll at the end make sure we wash up and go through all the questions. Scott's email address is on screen at the moment, but we will make sure it's in the chat later, so that if you do have any follow-up questions, you can send them to him by email afterwards. But I think that's enough from me. I'll hand over to you, Scott.
Okay, thank you very much, Nathan, and thank you everybody for coming this afternoon, morning, or whatever time it is in whatever part of the world you happen to be in. So this is the highs and lows. How does HiperDispatch really impact CPU efficiency? If that's not what you were expecting to hear about, you should probably go find a different stream. So anyways, this is the contact, copyright, and trademarks, which we don't really care about a whole lot. And here's the abstract, which I'm not going to read to you, because if you didn't read this, I'm not sure how you got here. But we're always welcome to have you if you just appeared randomly too. So if you're not familiar with enterprise performance strategies, we do ZOS performance. We have Pivoter, our reporting and analysis software and service. We do education and instruction. We have performance workshops that we teach periodically. We do a little bit of consulting, primarily around what we call performance war rooms, where we'll spend a couple of days with you and your team to have a group discussion about whatever's keeping you up at night regarding ZOS performance anyways. And those are always very well received, and they're a good time. And then we present information in other ways as well. We occasionally participate in the online forums. You might have seen me answering a question here or there. And of course, we have our own webinars that we do as well. This was our presentations this week. So we're coming to the end of the list here, but if I recall correctly, these will be all posted on the GSE website as well. So even though you can't go back in time, unless you happen to have one of those TARDISes, I understand that you will be able to see these later. So that should all be good. Alrighty, so this is the agenda for today. We'll go over a brief overview and review of HiperDispatch. We'll talk a little bit about the rules about medium pool processors. We'll talk about the common HiperDispatch expectations and measurements, and then we'll look at what we actually see in the real life measurements. We'll talk a little bit about warning track interrupts near the end, and then we'll have a conclusion, which will be about, well, how much should you actually worry about this? Alrighty, so let's get into the HiperDispatch overview for those of you who might not be familiar. HiperDispatch was introduced on the Z10 in 2008, and the goal was to improve performance through improved cache coherency. Basically, the whole idea here is that modern superscalar processors are really sensitive in terms of performance to how effective the processor caches are, okay? And so if you're not making effective use of the processor caches, you'll find that your processor will underperform relative to a workload that may be more cache friendly. Now, the issue that HiperDispatch was trying to deal with was avoiding splitting work across lots of CPs and instead trying to focus the work for a given LPAR on a smaller number of CPs, thereby reducing contention between LPARs for that very valuable and important processor cache resources. So part of the idea here was to mitigate what we used to call the short CP problem. The short CP problem was caused by having a high ratio of logical to physicals. We don't talk about the logical to physical ratio anymore, but at one point in time, that was a big discussion. You know, what's your logical to physical ratio? And you should keep it ideally below 2, certainly below 3, and all that sort of stuff. less of a problem or less of a discussion today, but the same concepts still absolutely apply, even with HiperDispatch. And again, HiperDispatch mitigates a lot of those. So while we need to understand them, HiperDispatch takes care of a lot of it for us. HiperDispatch did involve changes to both Prism and ZOS dispatching. This was originally optional, but the default and the expectation now is on, and in certain configurations, and if you're using SMT, it's required. So the expectation is certainly on today. The vast majority of the LPARs we look at have HiperDispatch on. I think it's been a little while since I've seen one with HiperDispatch off. So what does this actually look like? First of all, let's take another step back and talk about the LPAR's guaranteed share, which is what comes from the weight of the processors. As you're dividing up a machine, a physical number of processors into logical partitions into your LPARs where you're going to run ZOS, you have to proportion the resources of the machine out to those LPARs. You do that on the HMC with something called the weight. You have separate weights for each class of processor. So the ZIPs will have a different weight than the IFLs and the GPs and the ICFs, for example. And basically, the amount of capacity, the amount of resources, or the relative amount of resources that the LPAR gets is the relative weight compared to the total weight of all active LPARs on the machine. So, and we can express this in terms of a number of guaranteed processors. And basically, this is just your LPAR share times the LPAR or times the shared processor count. So we have an example down here. Now, in this example, we have the relatively rare situation of a ZOS LPAR with dedicated CPs. That's kind of unusual today. I'm not going to say we never see it, but it is kind of unusual. You will see dedicated processors with things like internal coupling facilities, ZVM LPARs for Linux and stuff like that, but ZOS LPARs, it's relatively rare. So the point here, though, is if you do have dedicated processors, those are set aside because they are, in fact, dedicated to the LPAR. We have 3 other LPARs on this machine. We have 6 processors that are shared, 6 physical processors that are shared between those 3 LPARs, and they have weights of 500, 350, and 150. Those weights very nicely add up to 1,000 in this case. That makes it easy to do math in your head. It doesn't have to add up to 1,000. Prism can do math easier than I can if they add up to 756 or whatever. Prism can do that math, but I just find it easier if they add up to 1,000. I've seen some sites, though, that make them based on, the total, that they total up to the number of MSUs on the machine or the number of MIPS on the machine because they can think about it that way. That's fine, too. So if we do this ratio here, and we have system B with a weight of 500, well, that's half of the capacity of those 6 shared processors. So basically 0.5 times 6 is 3 processors. You can do the math for sysc and sysd here, and you can see their guaranteed share expressed as a number of processors, okay? This is important, as we'll see in just a moment. Now, in horizontal CP management, prior to HiperDispatch, well, we didn't really call it horizontal CP management. We just called it what Prism does, right? But prior to HiperDispatch and what we now term horizontal CP management, Prism would split each logical CP on the LPAR evenly based on its share of a processor, okay? So down here, these circles here represent the logical processors for each of the LPARs. I guess I didn't mention down here, here are the physical processors, right, with Prism sitting in between. So in this case, sysb, we already said, is guaranteed access to 3 physical processors, but it has 6 logical processors. So if you do the math on that, 3 physicals divided by 6 means each of these logical processors is effectively half the capacity of a physical. sysc gets 3, so you can do the math. The 3 LPs here are actually 70% of a physical. And then sysd here, if you do the math, it comes out to 45% of a physical. Okay, now this is where you got into the situation of what we call short CPs, because you can imagine if instead of having 2 here, we had 6 here, right? So now sys D, you do that math, it wouldn't be 45% of a physical for each of its 6 if there were 6 here, it'd be 15%, right? So that's a very small slice of a processor, hence the idea of a short CP. Now with HiperDispatch, we'd start calling it vertical CP management, okay? Meaning that Prism endeavors to make the logical processors a larger percentage of a physical. And HiperDispatch classifies the processors in 3 tiers here, if you will, high, medium, and low. We sometimes call those verticals or polarity or pools. So whether it's high pool, high polarity, vertical high, they all mean the same thing. We're really talking about high, medium, and low processors, okay? The high processors are basically quasi-dedicated to the LPAR. They are given 100% share of a physical. A medium represents a share between 0 and 100% of a processor, and the lows are the logical processors that are unneeded to satisfy the LPAR's weight once you divvy it out across highs and mediums. Now, those vertical low processors are initially parked, okay? That doesn't mean they're offline, but ZOS doesn't dispatch work to them. So they're online to ZOS, but ZOS is not dispatching any work to them. They're just being unused from the LPAR's perspective. Now, every 2 seconds, basically the HiperDispatch algorithms kick in, and they decide whether or not to unpark or park a processor. So those vertical lows may become unparked and hence get work dispatched to them if there is demand from the LPAR that has that vertical low and there is available capacity on the machine, which really means other LPARs aren't fully consuming their weight, okay? And if that processor becomes unparked and there's work dispatched to it, at some point in time, there may be demand from other LPARs, and then that processor will get parked, and the LPAR that was enjoying that vertical low no longer will be able to dispatch work to it. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, this is the horizontal CP management chart or view of the world here. And if we imagine we have our 6 physical CPs here, the capacity, this is the boxes here, the vertical side box basically represents the capacity of the CP, the physical CP to do work. If we put sysb on here, again, this is prior to HiperDispatch, you can see it's spread horizontally across all of those physical processors because, again, we have 6 logicals. Without HiperDispatch, we spread those logicals across, or we spread the capacity across all 6 logicals. In the case of sysc, well, the sysc actually doesn't even fit on top of those physicals, so it wouldn't be exactly like this, right? But notionally, it'd be something like this, and then sysd would be here. Now, in reality, it can't really do this, again, because you have this extra over here. So it's going to have to shift things around dynamically as things come and go, as activity starts and stops, as the time slices expire for the individual LPARs. And so what it'll actually look like is something more like what you see over here, right? So across the physical CPs here are our 3 different LPARs, and we can see they're getting dispatched across all. For example, B is getting dispatched across all of the 6 CPs, but so is C and so is D. And basically everything is intermingled. And if you think about that again from the cache perspective, that means that these LPARs can be competing for those same caches. So B was running very nicely, work here, and then its time slice expired, and Prism dropped C in here. C ran for a bit, and then its time slice expired, and B came back. But guess what? The L1 and maybe L2 caches now, the data that B had there is gone because C was busy running here in the meantime. Okay. Now, in comparison to that, this is what you see in vertical CP management with HiperDispatch on. Now we have sysb here consuming the first 3 CPs. We have sysc, again, it has a vertical high, so it's consuming this CP here, plus a little bit over here, and then you have sysd here, right? And over time, what that'll look like is basically sys-B is dedicated to those first three physical processors. Sys-C basically gets processor 3, and processor 4 and 5, has the mediums from C and D intermingled. You'll notice that there's a vertical low here for B, and B occasionally gets to jump in and maybe do something on those vertical lows if they're not actually being used by the other LPARs. Now, this is a useful mental model to have. In reality, it's going to be a little more complicated, right? But this is a useful mental model to take from this. There is a point here about that the vertical highs also get longer dispatch intervals. So if you look at these as a dispatch interval, you'll notice the vertical highs are depicted here as having longer dispatch intervals compared to the vertical lows and the vertical mediums. These are not to scale, but it does represent the fact that you do get a longer dispatch interval with vertical highs. I just said that. I just said that it's a little more complicated. Oh, here's where we say the vertical highs are documented to get 100 millisecond time slices versus 12.5 to 25 milliseconds for vertical mediums and vertical lows. This is according to the fine manual. We'll talk about that a little bit more at the very end too. Yeah, and the vertical highs will only be shared with the vertical mediums or lows if that physical processor that's quasi-dedicated to the vertical high doesn't have demand for it. There's also this point about Prism will issue warning track interrupts to let LPARs know their time slice is about to end. We'll talk about this in more detail near the end of the presentation. Oh, and the other thing to note here is it is true that an LPAR may not have any, may not have all, and certainly it may not even have any of its logicals dispatched to a physical at any one given moment in time, right? If we come back here and we look here, for example, if we just draw a line down here, notice that during this moment in time here, however big that time is, right, which is probably on the order of microseconds, but nonetheless, there is a time period here where D might not be dispatched to any physicals, okay? Something important to keep in mind. This is just the slide showing, hey, HiperDispatch off, we got a spaghetti mess. You can see there's lots of contention for the L1, L2 caches. We go to HiperDispatch on, life is great, this looks better, and we'll likely get better L1 and L2 utilization. Now, that's all very straightforward. There are some interesting notes around what's a medium pool and how much weight does it get, though. So basically, HiperDispatch prefers to not have vertical mediums with a low weight. Instead, a vertical high will be taken as a second vertical medium, and the two VMs share their weight of those two engines. So for an example, an LPAR with a weight giving it access to 2.4 CPs worth of capacity, you have two vertical highs and one vertical medium. Prism's not going to do that, okay? Because the vertical medium is at 40%. Instead, what Prism will do will take one of those vertical highs, add it to the vertical mediums, and we'll end up with two vertical mediums at 70%, because 100% plus, so we have 140% spread across two vertical mediums, plus we'll have one vertical high. Basically, Prism wants a single medium pool CP to get at least a 50% share of a physical CP. And if your weight of an LPAR equates to something just under 1, 2.5, 1.5, 5.5 CPs of capacity, getting it to that, 5.5 instead of 5.49 should result in an extra vertical high. This has led to people, including myself at times, right, saying, oh, well, you might want to consider, if you're trying to get a little extra performance out of this LPAR, just shift a little weight from one of these other LPARs you don't care as much about over to this one, and you'll go from, 5.49 to 5.51, and yay, you got instead of having two vertical mediums, one of those vertical mediums got to be a vertical high. Won't that be great? this is actually the generation of this, the genesis of this particular presentation, because even though, like I said, I've recommended that once or twice, I've had people ask me about that, and I've said, sure, why not? It might help a little bit. My question always was, does it actually help enough to matter? And that's what we're going to really focus on here. That's why I actually started looking into this. Now, there is some confusion out there sometimes around, oh, will I get one vertical medium or two, or and just to confuse things more, the Z13 has different rules. If you're still in the Z13, there are some different rules about when the weight is between 1.5 and 2 CPs, instead of getting one vertical high and one vertical medium, as you might expect. So if it equates out to 1.7 CPs worth of capacity, you might expect to get one vertical high and a vertical medium at 70% share, but depending on the Z13 and I think the level of microcode, it may get two vertical mediums. So just understand if you're on the Z13, there's some things there. Basically, you can only have a vertical medium if its weight will be at least half a CP, unless you have a tiny LPAR that's going to equate to less than that anyways, right? Otherwise, you demote a vertical high and it gets divided between the two vertical mediums. So again, your LPAR with a weight of 2.1 CPs would have one vertical high and two vertical mediums at 0.55 each. So that means if you have two vertical mediums, they will always have a weight between 0.5 and 0.75 because of this formula here, except for those small LPARs that have a weight of less than 1 CP, and except for the Z13 scenario above. So there is that. Now, if the vertical medium would have had a weight greater than 0.5, then it can stand on its own, and you may have an LPAR with X number of vertical highs and one vertical medium with a weight that is greater than 0.5. And in those situations, you could have a vertical medium that has a weight approaching of 1 CP's worth of capacity. Alrighty, now there's a number of HiperDispatch expectations out there, right? So the common belief and expectation is that vertical high processors perform better. I mean, after all, they're quasi-dedicated to the LPAR. We expect them to perform better for the LPAR that is enjoying those. And vertical low processors will perform worse because after all, that's capacity that's not really needed. We park them and unpark them and all that sort of stuff. They're shared with other LPARs, so surely those are going to perform worse. And there's also this concept too that HiperDispatch is geared towards machines with many processors. Well, it's certainly more important with many processors. It's important too when you just have a few processors as well. It is common to hear, as I said, the recommendations to tweak the LPAR weights to get that extra vertical high. And there's also this common recommendation to not use low pool processors. The IBM recommendation is not to have more than 2 vertical low processors on your LPAR. I like to be a little nicer than IBM, so I'll say 3. Frankly, if the vertical lows are never being used, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. But when they are being used, there can be situations where they can be problematic. In other situations, they're not necessarily problematic. It depends on the configuration of the machine, depends on a bunch of different things. So the easy recommendation is if you have an LPAR with a bunch of vertical lows, that probably, and those vertical lows are being used, what that really means is that you need to make a weight adjustment for that LPAR. And you might need to make that weight adjustment dynamically or multiple times throughout the day. Just to point out here that I'm only talking about ZOS here. The impacts to ZVM and ZLinux may be a little bit different. Not really my area of expertise, so I'm not really going to talk about those today. So how can we measure efficiency? Well, the commonly cited measures of efficiency in relative to what we're talking about here today are really the CPI and the RNI, or the cycles per instruction and the relative nest intensity. Now, both of these numbers, lower numbers are better. The cycles per instruction is exactly what it says. How many machine cycles on average does it take for an instruction to complete? This is actually broken down into 2 different numbers. The first number is called the instruction complexity CPI. This is the CPI influenced by the instruction mix, okay? Because some instructions will take longer than other instructions. An add register is going to be pretty darn fast. If you're executing the instruction to compress a block of data, that's not going to run nearly as fast as the add register, right? Yeah, that seems fairly obvious to you probably. Now, the other portion of CPI is what's called the finite cache CPI. This is the CPI, the portion of the overall cycles per instruction that's influenced by cache contention, because the caches are finite and you won't always find that data that you're looking for actually in the L1 or the L2 cache or the L3 or the L4. You may have to go all the way out to memory. The further away from the processor you go to get that block of memory, actually that cache line, the longer that takes, then the longer that takes. I mean, time is measured in machine cycles, right? So because of that, that will drive up your CPI, which essentially is saying it's taking you more time on average to execute an instruction. The other measure, which is somewhat less interesting to me. It's interesting, but it's a little squishier, I think, is the relative nest intensity. This is a calculation based on a formula provided by IBM that calculates a relative number that is workload related and should be relatively stable when moving between processor generations. Basically, it's useful for showing the relative impact of cache misses at each level. So if your RNI is lower, that means that you're probably getting more of your data out of the lower level caches, the L1, L2 caches. That's more efficient. Lower RNIs generally mean you're getting more effective capacity out of the machine for your particular workload. So we look at it, but I personally prefer to look at CPI because I think it's a little more direct. And the most direct answer, though, of course, is if you make a change and you look at the CPU consumption for the workload, well, if the CPU consumption goes down, that was a good change, right? That's really what you're looking for at the end of the day, right? Now, this is actually difficult to do on most systems because there's a lot of workload variation from day to day, moment to moment, right? So you have to take a look over multiple executions to account for the normal variations and the cross workload and cross LPAR contentions and all that sort of stuff. So in many cases, trying to measure that difference is actually relatively difficult because we're usually talking about relatively small differences. Now, to that point, can we justify the love of the vertical highs and the hate of the vertical lows, right? So if we look at the estimated finite CPI for each of these, we would expect that the vertical highs will show a lower estimated finite CPI. Remember, lower is better. Vertical lows will show a higher estimated finite CPI, and we'll expect vertical mediums to be in the middle. So my question is, do we see this? And the answer is maybe sometimes it depends, right? So what does it look like? What does it depend on? That's the interesting stuff. So I have some real life measurements from some real systems here. So in this case here, what we're looking at is we're looking at the estimated finite CPI for this particular system. I guess this one is sysn. It's running on a Z15, and we've summarized the different processors by their polarity, right? So we have a low pool, one or more low pool, medium, and high pool processors, and this is just the average of the CPI, estimated finite CPI across those. And remember, lower is better. And in fact, the high pool processors down here have a lower estimated finite CPI. So yay, that matches our expectation. And notice it's a significant difference between the vertical mediums and the vertical low here. You'll notice that, oh, well, why does the blue line only show up partially? Well, it's because a lot of the day it was parked, right? So it wasn't actually doing anything for a good chunk of the day. But when it was unparked, it was mostly worse off, less efficient than the vertical medium processors. So This is exactly what we'd expect. We'd look at this and say, oh, great, look at how much more efficient your vertical highs are versus your vertical mediums. Hence, we would say, we'd like to justify, oh, we should, maybe convert that. We got two vertical mediums, convert one of those to a vertical high, and you'll get so much more effective capacity out of the machine. Rarely, though, does it actually look this nice. More often, we get things that look like this. Now, in this particular case, again, green is that vertical high. For much of the day, probably during the batch hours here, the three processor types are actually running very, very similarly in terms of the estimated finite CPI. During the day, the vertical high is actually running worse. It's less efficient than the vertical mediums and vertical lows. What the heck's going on here, right? Well, and how about here? Here we have only mediums and lows. There is no vertical high, right? So this is probably a smaller LPAR, doesn't have enough weight to even justify a vertical high. The fact that we have a vertical low used throughout the day implies to me this is probably a LPAR with two logical CPs. Those two logical CPs add up to less than a half of they add up to less than one CP's worth of capacity probably, and they end up with a vertical low here that's always unparked. So what I did here is this is the same system, same report, only instead of just looking at whether they're vertical highs or vertical mediums or vertical lows, I also added a flag in here to say, were these processors actually processing IO interrupts? And when we add in the IO interrupt information here, what we see is, oh, the vertical medium is the processor handling IO interrupts. That one's yes. And the darker blue vertical low down here is generally not handling IO interrupts. Now, interestingly, we do see overnight here, we got light blue, which would be the low yes situation. So occasionally that vertical low is used to handle IO interrupts, but during most of the day, the vertical low is not handling IO interrupts. The vertical medium is handling IO interrupts. So now it makes a little more sense about why the vertical medium is less efficient, because you think about it, the vertical medium sitting there processing processing real instructions, doing real useful business work for you, and then an IO interrupt comes in and oops, it's got to go handle the IO interrupt, move some data around, and now it can go back to real work. But that has an impact on the caches too, because again, it's moving data around and stuff like that. So in general, what we will see through these charts is that if you have a CP that is handling IO interrupts, that CP is probably running a little less efficiently in terms of the estimated finite CPI. Now, in this particular case, the LPAR has one vertical medium and three vertical lows. Again, because of that, we'll have one vertical low that's always unparked. I added in this chart now the logical CP number so we can we can spread apart those multiple vertical lows. So there's only one vertical medium at logical CP number 0. Logical CP number 2 is a vertical low that sometimes is not processing IO interrupts and sometimes is processing IO interrupts. Similarly for 4 and 6 here are actually never processing IO interrupts. Again, the processor that is handling IO interrupts is running a little bit less efficiently. Also here, you might look at it and say, well, Scott, though, the vertical low there, that purple one, where's the purple one? Over here, it didn't seem to be really impacted a whole lot by handling the IO interrupts. Well, that's because if we delved deeper, and I didn't show it on the chart, but if you delve deeper, what you'd actually find is that the medium is handling most of the IO interrupts. There's only a small portion that's overflowing to the lows. Now, here's the system with a couple of vertical highs and or a vertical high. I say a couple. No, there is a couple. Yes, 0 and 1. There we go. So there's a couple of vertical highs here. The green one here that is processing IO interrupts is actually running less efficient for at least part of the day. And that's again because it's handling those IO interrupts. Now here we have a much larger system, so we have multiple vertical highs, a few vertical lows, and a vertical medium here. And the interesting part here is that we start to see this striation that we would actually expect to see, right? So down here we have the vertical highs. We have one vertical high, this red one here, that looks like it's a little bit different. And the reason it's a little bit different is it's processing most of the IO interrupts. Okay, and then you have the mediums and the lows up here. So definitely a more kind of more like what we'd actually expect to see. But sometimes our expectations are not met. Here, we actually have a vertical high that is processing IO interrupts, this orange processor here, and it's actually the most efficient one. So what's going on here? This is unusual. I've only seen this a couple of times, and the first time I saw this, I'm like, what the heck? This now has turned my idea that, oh, doing IO interrupts is making me less efficient. It's turned it upside down. When I actually delved a little bit deeper and went to look at this particular LPAR, it turns out this LPAR is not doing a whole lot of CPU work, but it's doing a whole lot of IO. So there was a whole lot of IO interrupts that are being handled by this one processor, and it's not doing a whole lot of other work. So from that perspective, if your processor is just handling IO interrupts, or largely handling IO interrupts, I guess it'll be a lot more efficient, right? Because A, there's less instructions, so the mix of instructions is less varied. And so from that perspective, it makes sense that it's running at a different CPI than the rest of them. So that's interesting. Now, sometimes we get to a situation like this and you look at it and go, there's really no difference here at all. So, you know, we can look at those and there's really not much going on here at all. Now, so having said that, should we go through that effort of trying to convert a vertical medium to the vertical high if we're in that situation of, you know, we have two vertical mediums, let's try and get an extra vertical high instead. This means you have to take weight from another LPAR. Certainly, if those other LPARs that you're taking the weight from needs that weight to get their work done, that could have a negative impact on those other LPARs. And the remaining VM will have less weight than the two VMs did before. So the new vertical high may be more efficient, but those vertical mediums may be less efficient. Now, if the LPAR already has a lot of vertical highs, I'd say that adding one more is probably not a big deal to it. Now, if the LPAR has 0 or maybe even one vertical high, then that vertical high will likely be now handling the IO interrupts, meaning it may not be substantially more efficient than what it was already at with the being a vertical medium. But importantly, you might see less IO dispatch delay. Okay. So the idea here is that, of course, again, the vertical highs are quasi-dedicated to the LPAR. If you think about the idea that a vertical medium may not be dispatched by Prism to the LPAR at any one given moment in time because it's shared with other LPARs, right? So if an IO interrupt comes in and that processor that's supposed to handle the IO interrupts is not dispatched to the LPAR, well, the LPAR is not going to get that IO interrupt until that processor gets dispatched to the LPAR. So having the vertical highs there to handle the IO interrupts means that you can see potentially less IO dispatch delay, which is that delay time from when the IO actually completed and the LPAR actually got to process that IO. Now, some notes on these weights. The most important thing you can do is to make sure the LPAR has sufficient weight for its work. This can be much more important, having trouble talking, than tweaking to convert a vertical high to a vertical medium. I should say here actually that this is more important than tweaking to convert a vertical high to a vertical medium. This may involve multiple vertical highs and vertical mediums, for example, not just one. Now, you can change your weight automatically via automation and some Rex code. This has been around for quite a while, since ZOS 2.1. So, you know, go see the members here in SampLive. Here's a link to documentation. This is not terribly difficult. We see real customers doing this in real life. Took a survey of people at one point in time, and I think we about 40% of the people on the whatever the webinar was when I put that survey question in said that they actually were dynamically changing weights. So it is certainly something that people are doing. It's not this arcane thing that's difficult to do. You very well may want to change the weights twice a day if your overnight needs are different than your daytime needs. Or you might change them based on expected loads, right? So maybe Fridays are less busy in production than on Mondays. And so maybe you can give the dev test people a little extra work, a little extra weight to get their work done a little bit faster. Now, there's also something called Intelligent Resource Director. I'm not really going to talk about that today. IRD can move weights between LPARs as well. It only works within a sysplex, and it can be slow to react. I suspect you are probably smarter than Intelligent Resource Director. I give you all more credence for intelligence and understanding your work than IRD. So here's an example of a system where they are shifting weights overnight versus daytime. And this is pretty significant for this sysd LPAR here. You can see when the weight changes, they go from 2 high pool processors plus a medium to now 3 plus 2 mediums, okay? So this is pretty significant, especially if this LPAR needs the capacity of at least 3 CPs or 4 CPs or even 5 CPs during the day. If they didn't do this weight change, the LPAR would have to be parking and unparking these vertical lows to be able to get that capacity. Okay, so this is a significant change. Again, now we have 3 CPs instead of 2 to get that longer 100 millisecond dispatch interval. This is probably significantly good for sysd. Now, in comparison, it's a zero-sum game. That weight had to come from somewhere. In this case, it came from sys2. In this particular case, sys2 went from 11 highs plus 2 mediums to 10 highs plus 1 medium. So basically, it lost a single vertical high, and it basically lost a vertical medium. The impact here is still, this very well may be noticeable for sys2, but the percentage impact in terms of the number of vertical highs impacted is much lower for sys2 than it was for sysd. So it's relatively minor on a percentage change, right? Relative change compared to sysd. Now, is this good or bad for sys2 versus sysd? Well, obviously it depends on the nature of the work, depends on your business goals for that work. I don't know what these systems are used for or what the work is or why they're changing them, changing those weights, but they apparently have done some work to say this is what we need at these times of the day. So again, I don't even remember who this is, but kudos to these people for doing this. I wish more people did this sort of thing. Alrighty, so coming down to 15 minutes, so this is just about perfect. So this is discussing a little more about those vertical medium and the vertical lows and why those can be less efficient. And even if they're not showing necessarily less efficient from a CPI perspective, they can be less efficient in terms of delays for things like we talked about in terms of like the IO delays, right? So these fancy charts here, what I've tried to do is I've simplified it now. We have 2 physical CPs here. It doesn't matter which ones are Y or anything. And we have these LPARs here. I have sys-A, and sys-A has I'm showing a couple of logical CPs here for sys-A. And I have workload, these work units on sys-A. We have green, blue, orange, yellow work units. And those work units are being dispatched by ZOS to a logical CP. Now, ZOS is time slicing things too, right? So it's putting the work on the logical CP, maybe green's time slice ended here, and so he put the blue task here, and then maybe the blue gave up his time slice because he had to do an IO or something like that. He went into a wait, and so ZOS puts the green back on this logical CP. Obviously, in real life, it's a lot more complicated, but this is, again, a useful mental model. The other thing to point out here is that this is not to scale, right? So the ZOS time slices is on the order of microseconds or millionths of a second, and the Prism time slices are on the order of milliseconds or thousandths of a second, okay? So there's 3 orders of magnitude between ZOS time slicing and Prism time slicing here, okay? You can see the numbers over here to make that help that make sense to you. Now, from a Prism perspective, ZOS can give up the CPs if it's done using those logical CPs and has no more work to dispatch on that logical CP at the moment. And in that case, Prism can step in and take that logical CP or that physical CP and dispatch a different logical CP from a different LPAR over to that physical CP. Okay, so in this case, sys A gave up the CPs here. We got sys B that got dispatched onto that physical CP by Prism. Here down here we have sys C that got dispatched on it. And this is what you would expect to see. Here sys C has relatively a short time slice. Again, maybe sys C has gone into a wait. It's doing IO, it's issued an IO, has nothing more to dispatch on this logical CP. It gives it back to Prism. Prism can dispatch something else on it. This is the default for wait completion equals no, which is the default in the recommendation. And as of, forget whether it was a Z16 or Z15, one of those more recent machines, you no longer can specify wait completion equals yes. So this is the way it should be running. Now, what if the ZOS task wasn't done? Well, that can be a problem, right? So in this case here, what if the green task was not actually done, but the ZOS LPAR's time slice for that physical processor has ended? Well, Prism will take that away, take that physical processor away from the ZOS LPAR and give it to a different LPAR, in this case, sys-B. Now, unfortunately, what that means is that the green task here is dispatched to a logical processor that has no physical to run on, right? So sys-A's logical green task here is basically flatlined. It can't do anything because there's no physical processor to run on. It has to wait until Prism gives back the physical processor to to sys-A here before it can actually pick back up and keep running. So this is a bunch of words about that involuntary wait issue, that the idea that Prism will steal a physical processor from an LPAR, and you may have a task then effectively suspended because there's no hardware to run on. Now, with HiperDispatch, we only expect this to happen for vertical mediums and vertical lows. Remember, the vertical highs are quasi-dedicated. So if you have a vertical high processor, hey, it's not going, the work that's running there is not going to be subject to this sort of problem, right? Even when time slice has ended, if the LPAR still has demand for that processor, Prism is expected to give it back to it. So we shouldn't see that sort of involuntary wait on the vertical highs. Now, for the vertical mediums and the vertical lows, the documentation says the Prism dispatch interval is generally expected to be between 12.5 and 25 milliseconds. If you do the math, in most configurations, it works out to, it's probably going to be closer to 12.5 than 25. 12.5 milliseconds is a long time in terms of CPU processing. You can do a lot of CPU work in 12.5 milliseconds. So this can be a long time for a task to be involuntarily stranded. And the worst case scenario is the vertical lows, right? So if you have a task that's stranded on a vertical low, what happens if HiperDispatch goes, oh, wait, the other LPARs need this capacity and parks that vertical low? It could be seconds or longer before that vertical low gets unparked. So this could be especially painful if an important task gets stuck there. This was a recognized problem. So with the EC12, Prism came out with something called the warning track interrupts. Basically, Prism now tells ZOS, I'm about to take that processor away from you, get your stuff off it, right? ZOS gets a grace period to basically undispatch the running task from the logical processor and then return that physical processor back to Prism. And then, of course, ZOS could then redispatch that task to an active logical processor that it does have. Now, if ZOS doesn't return the processor to Prism in time, Prism's going to take the processor anyways. And that's called an unsuccessful warning track interrupt. We'd like our warning tracks to be successful because that means ZOS has moved stuff away and voluntarily given it back. The idea is that this should help avoid having work hung on the logical processor that's not going to get redispatched for some time. Again, this is an old thing. This has been around since the EC12 days, so a few machine generations back, right? So what happens if that ZOS task wasn't done? Prism issues a warning track here. ZOS undispatches the green task. And so now that green task, yes, isn't running because, oh, sys-A doesn't have any physical processors to run on, at least that we're depicting here, right? But in this case, when sys-C finishes with a physical processor 4 down here and gives that processor back to Prism, Prism happens to give that physical processor to sys-A, well, now sys-A could redispatch that green task on this physical processor down here. Yes, it might not be as good as coming up to this one here, depending upon where they are physically located in the cache and so forth, or in the nest. But the general idea here is that, hey, green could get back to work faster than waiting for this processor to come back. And then again, when this one does come back, just like before, hey, the blue task can still make use of this capacity, right? So in general, this is goodness and what we'd expect. Now, what do we actually see? So to be honest with you, there's like 3 measurements for warning track interrupts in the SMF data. And to be honest, I don't think I've ever looked at them until I was doing this analysis for this presentation. I got interested and said, oh, let's take a look at them. And so here's a graph. Most of the time, this is kind of uninteresting, but the important part here is that the blue is a successful successful warning track interrupts, and the orange is the unsuccessful warning track interrupts. And the green here is just the partition dispatch time. Okay, which is a stand-in for how busy is the LPAR, right? And so what we see, the LPAR gets busier, and look, there's a bunch more warning track interrupts, and most of the time, the warning track interrupts are actually successful, which is what we'd hope to see. Now, there is this correlation between how busy the LPAR is, at least in terms of this big spike here, and the spike of warning track interrupts. That makes a lot of sense, right? Because if the LPAR had several or multiple vertical highs, it's only, again, the vertical mediums and the vertical lows that we expect to see those warning track interrupts. And because of that, you're only going to see them, for example, when those vertical mediums get involved and if you're unparking the vertical lows. So, this is probably vertical medium stuff over here. And over here, we have the more vertical mediums. This big chunk here is probably we unparked some vertical lows, did some work, and those got a lot of warning track interrupts. So we could look at that, of course, by the CP type here too. And in fact, that's what we see. If you look for these blue, orange, green colors down here for the vertical highs, you'll notice there's no warning track interrupts, right? Which is exactly what you'd expect. We do see a little bit for this pink and gray, which are the mediums, but the purple and the brown are what are driving some of this spike here as well. So, and the other point too is these vertical mediums prior to this spike may not have had capacity available to do them. Oh, and the lower polarity CPs may have fewer WTIs per interval just because the lows may have been parked for part of that interval as well. So another important point here. So the one thing that's interesting though is the total number of warning track interrupts that came out of the data. And the interesting thing here to me is if we look at these numbers and say, well, these are 900-second intervals. I'm not sure what 200,000 divided by 900 is, but it's somewhere north of 200, right? Because if it was 1,000, it'd be 200. So it's 220 or something like that, right? I wasn't expecting to see 220 warning track interrupts for a CP per second. It doesn't really make sense because it doesn't jive with the whole idea of the Prism dispatch interval being 12.5 to 25 milliseconds, which would be on the order of having up to 80 of these per second. So how we get to 200, I don't know. Kind of suspect it's a problem in the data. I've asked several of my IBM friends and they all said, don't know about that. So I don't know either. I suspect it's a data problem, but who knows? Okay, so my conclusions in the last few minutes I have here, the effects of HiperDispatch are most obvious on LPARs with several CPs, but it still has benefit on those LPARs with fewer CPs as well. And the vertical highs are certainly where you see most of it. Efficiency bipolarity can be confusing, especially if you have relatively few CPs. We saw when we had lots of CPs, we saw the bigger a little more separation in the bands. And part of that is whether or not the CPs are handling IO interrupts. On LPARs with a vertical medium and the vertical low, the unparked vertical low is effectively a vertical medium. So if it's unparked and used all the time, it runs more or less like a vertical medium. On the larger LPARs with the vertical lows that are regularly unused or regularly used, they also may be similar to the vertical mediums, but as that keck get busier, they will likely suffer more and become less efficient. Like I just said, usually the CPs handling IO interrupts will be a bit less efficient. So if you're not accounting for that, that can cause some confusion. And the vertical mediums and the vertical lows, which will take warning track interrupts, which may reduce their dispatch, or by definition, is reducing their dispatch interval. So that's another impact to the vertical mediums and vertical lows. Note down here, you do less IO, you'll have less IO interrupts, which means you'll have more efficient CPU. Go back and look at my presentation from a couple of days ago about avoiding IO. Finally, my final summary slide here. How much should you care? My answer is probably not much. Set your LPAR weights appropriately. That's the most important thing. And enable HiperDispatch, and you probably don't need to worry about it beyond that. Now, the IO interrupts being handled by the processors with more weights, that's a good thing, especially when it happens to be vertical highs, because it helps ensure those interrupts aren't delayed. In COS 3.1, I believe, they're actually changing the way this works so that basically there will always be two CPs enabled for IO interrupt to help avoid the problem where the interrupt comes in and there's no CPs available. Because if you only have one enabled, that one might not be dispatched to a physical processor to be able to do it. Warning track is a good thing. The number of WTIs is surprising. I still would like to understand why that is. And maybe that's just, again, a problem with the data because of those three measurements in the SMF data. I wouldn't be surprised if nobody else has really looked at them for several years either. I will say that probably in most cases, the conversion of a vertical medium to a vertical high will not result in a significant improvement that you'll actually be able to measure. However, correcting your weights to avoid using vertical lows is a good and beneficial practice. Some minor sporadic use of those vertical lows is probably fine, but certainly flapping or using multiple vertical lows over an extended period of time implies that your weights are wrong. And if you correct those weights for that period of time, you may have more vertical highs, could be a good thing. And using automation to change those weights would be a very good idea as well. Alrighty. I have come to exactly the top of the hour. My clock ticked over to 11:00:00 just as I said that. I feel exceptional about that. So if you have any questions, I certainly can. I'm happy to take questions. And I think Nathan already said fill out your feedback, but there's a QR code if you want to scan it with your phone right now.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Perfect timing, absolutely perfect timing. We didn't have any questions in the chat. I will just run through, double check, but no, I can't see any. Would you mind just popping your email address in the chat, just so people can copy and paste it? Perfect, thank you. So I'll give people a moment just to see if there is any questions. But if not, your email address is there and they could copy and paste it and follow up with you later.
Absolutely.
And as you've reminded everyone, QR code for feedback is there. There is also a link in the chat. We really appreciate the feedback and it does help us with the organisation of the November conference. I'll just ad lib for a moment and just to give people a little bit more chance to write some questions. And whilst doing that, I'll just give a reminder that our next session is in 30 minutes time. So we hope to see everybody there. Yeah, and that's it. Will be it for this virtual conference. But as soon as we don't seem to have any questions, we'll leave it there, I think. Scott, thank you. It was a really interesting session, very in-depth and thorough. And I'm sure if people would like a copy of the slides, they could send you an email and get a copy of them.
They should be able to get them from GSE UK too.
They would also be on GSE UK. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, they're on our website too. So, or send me an email and I'll be happy to send you a copy too. So whatever works.
Perfect. Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.